BYU offensive tackle Kingsley Suamataia is getting a lot of attention when it comes to the NFL draft. He's also expected to lead BYU into the Big 12 this fall. We're going to be joined by Max Chadwick, who had a great conversation with him for PFF earlier this week on today's show.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, your resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day, and thank you to all of you who are our everydayers with us here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Excited to welcome in Max Chadwick, of course, a college football analyst for Pro Football Focus, and also host of Preferred Walk-On. Max, thanks again for taking some time to join us here on Locked On Cougars.
Of course, Jake. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, I want to start here with you. You had a great piece for PFF, Pro Football Focus, earlier this week with Kingsley Suamataia, BYU offensive lineman. A guy, five-star prospect, transfers in from Oregon after starring at Orem High School, just a stone's throw away from BYU. Give me a sense, just based on kind of your takeaways from the conversation with him, where this kid stands as BYU gets ready to jump into the Big 12 Conference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's clearly the leader, I would say, of that BYU team right now. First round pick in the NFL draft. And, you know, as a pass blocker, he's one of the best in the country. You know, he had an 80-plus pass blocker. This past year didn't allow a single sack all year as well. And just talking to the guy, man, I mean, he was one of my favorite interviews that I've done so far. I mean, he was hilarious. He even fired me up a couple times. Like, I asked him, what separates you from other tackles around the country? And he was saying, just the heart that I have, man. I'm playing for my family. They rely on me. So every time I step on the field, I'm playing for them. And, you know, there's no jokes out there. He said, you know, once I go out there on the field, it's just me versus you. And I was like, okay, man, let's go. And he's a really funny guy. And, you know, also a guy who's very fiery. You can see the fire inside of him as well. So, yeah, BYU's got a good one for sure.
Now, you mentioned that he's got that heart. You mentioned he's also comparing himself to top-level offensive tackles. I read a lot of mock drafts, I look at PFFs, I look at all the different ones out there, and by and large, most of them have him as a first-round draft pick. If I'm not mistaken, you have him at that level as well yourself.
Yeah, I do. And, you know, you look at my mock draft, what I put up for PFF, and I had him, I think, around OT5, OT6, but still a first-round pick. And, like, that's just how special the offensive tackle class is next year. And even mentioned it in the interview. I talked to him. I said, hey, do you look at any of those mock drafts and see yourself in on the first round? What does that mean to you? And he goes, yeah, I look at it, but only because I want to see what tackles are being taken ahead of me in those mock drafts. He even mentioned them. He said, yeah, I know the guy from Penn State talking about Olu Fashanu, the guy from Notre Dame talking about Joe Alt, the guy from Alabama talking about J.C. Latham. He's like, I see those guys, and I want to pass them. I want to be the best out there. So, yeah, he pays attention to that stuff. I think he's going to be a first-round pick. I think he's got all the tools in the world. I'm excited for him to move to left tackle this year from right tackle, taking over for Blake Freeland. So, yeah, all the tools in the world. He was an excellent pass protector, mean run blocker too. You know, he mentioned run blocking, said, you know, run blocking is just about who has the bigger nuts out there, which was, I thought, one of my favorite moments of the interview. But, yeah, I think he's got all the tools in the world. And if he has a great redshirt sophomore year, could enter that top three tackle conversation with Alt, Fashanu, and Latham.
How big is it going to be for him in particular to be playing at the Power 5 level this year and prove himself against that level of competition if he truly wants to be that first-round pick?
Yeah, and he even mentioned that too, where I brought it up. I was like, hey, man, are you excited about that? He's like, yeah. You know, he was like, listen, I don't want to say that any of our games, like, you just look past them. But he's like, but now this time, you need to be on your game every single time. So he was very much looking forward to playing a Power 5 schedule every time. It's going to help him too. I mean, you know, you're not going to have the excuse when you look at him pre-draft and say, oh, you know, he played a group of 5 schedule. Now, of course, the Big 12 defensively not the strongest compared to the Big 10 or SEC, but still better than the group of 5 schedule they were playing before. So yeah, he was very excited about that, and he's like, yeah, I am very, very much looking forward to it. And I think it could only help him, honestly, when the NFL draft comes around.
Now, the other question I had off of that is the fact you mentioned he's going to be a redshirt sophomore. So he's relatively young with regards to his college eligibility. Will that be a concern in your mind in terms of just maybe not having as many games under his belt as some of these other elite tackles might have?
He actually, funny enough, he actually mentioned that as the reason why he thinks he's not being mentioned with Alt, Fashanu, and Latham. He's like, yeah, I guess I just don't have the experience, but you'll see, very soon. So, yeah, he's still very young. I don't know if that'll be much of an issue this year, because then he'll have 2 years of starting at BYU under his belt at right tackle and left tackle, which is about, you usually see 2 years from a guy, especially a 3-year guy. You see about 2 years of starting experience if they come out in the draft. So I don't think it'll be an issue. I think right now it could be an issue for him because it's only 1 year. But there are a ton of NFL draft prospects looking ahead that have only been 1-year starters too. So, yeah, like Olu Fashanu, for example, for Penn State, he was only a 1-year starter for Penn State last year. So I don't think it's an issue for him at all. I think he'll be fine heading into the 2024 draft if he declares for it.
Now, obviously, he is a guy, great body. I had a chance to stand next to him, actually, and we were having a conversation, and he told me he's slimmed down a little bit. He's obviously thinking about his future and what he wants to accomplish. Do you think that there is anything in particular in his game that he needs to shore up or maybe show out on the field this fall in particular?
Yeah, I think it just continue the progression. I think as a pass blocker, he was really impressive. I think as a run blocker, he's mean. That's a big thing I love watching his tape. He's mean, but there are times where he can, miss a block here or there in the run game. So that's why his run blocking grade wasn't the highest compared to like someone like Joe Alt or something like that. So yeah, pass protection, continue to progress in that area. I'm excited for him. He's actually told me, he's like, yeah, I'm actually excited because left tackle is my natural position. I played there all throughout my life and in high school. Right tackle, I never really played before. So he's like, I feel like I'm back home now, left tackle. So it could be a brand new player that we see out of Kingsley this year. But yeah, I think, improve, the consistency as a run blocker because he's got the mean streak. He's going to blow you up in the run game. He's got a number of reps like that. But yeah, and I'm just excited to see him against the Power 5 schedule too. So yeah, I think just continue to improve in all aspects, I think, for him because like I mentioned before, he's a really young player. He's only going to continue to get better. He's got all the tools already. You don't need to worry about that. So yeah, I think just continue to progress in all areas.
Got an interesting question for you here. Can you quantify how impressive it is that BYU has put their last 3 starting left tackles, speaking of Brady Christensen now with the Carolina Panthers, Blake Freeland with the Indianapolis Colts, and should Kingsley declare next year, he's probably going to be in the NFL. Can you quantify how impressive that is to have 3 straight left tackles hit and obviously make their dreams come true in the NFL?
Yeah, it's so impressive. And, that BYU offensive line, not only the left tackles, man, the interior offensive line is always usually pretty good, too. James Empey is a guy that I was a big fan of, at BYU. And, yeah, I mean, you look at Blake Freeland, not only did he grade super well for PFF, also was like one of the most athletic offensive tackles we've ever seen at the NFL Combine. I think he broke the vertical jump record for offensive tackles. You mentioned Brady Christensen, another guy who grades out really well for PFF. So yeah, Kingsley looks like the next in line. I think he's better than both of those guys too, in terms of how he is as a prospect. So yeah, Kingsley, while those guys weren't first round picks, I think Kingsley very easily could be a first round pick because 5-star recruit, got the pedigree, like I mentioned before, he's got the tools. I think he could be the highest drafted out of those 3 guys.
All right, I want to kind of expand our conversation a little bit and talk a little about BYU overall as they enter the Big 12 with Max. We'll get to that here in just a moment. Need to get a quick word in, though, on one of our great sponsors here on Locked On Cougars. That's our friends over at FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA Finals, my friends, because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. The best part about FanDuel, they got great promotions every single day. They range everywhere and anywhere. The best part about that is they also have a safe and secure app, making it really easy for you guys to trust what you're doing. And the best part, I guess, additionally, is that you get paid out instantly if you want to cash out right away. So there's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sports book. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. Excuse me. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. That's FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Thank you for being everydayers with us here on the podcast. Looking forward to a fun weekend out there. Hope you guys all have big plans. We'll reconvene on Monday and recap everything going on in BYU sports. We'll also continue our look back at BYU's independent era. Max, we've kind of been doing a fun thing here on the podcast to kind of clue you in. I've gone back throughout the offseason looking at all 155 games that BYU played as an independent football program, and it's been kind of fun because my professional career covering BYU spans essentially that era of BYU football. So it's been a fun deal, and we'll get back to that on our Monday edition of the podcast. But I want to talk to you about BYU as they make the transition to the Big 12 now. You guys at Pro Football Focus, I think most people know, very much analytical, grades, all that type of stuff. You guys look at the game at almost a granular level. So I want to start just kind of with a broad view. For those out there who hear me talk about PFF grades and are probably like, Jake, what in the heck are you talking about? Like, can you help our listeners understand a little bit more of what PFF's overarching goals are?
Yeah, so we try to do the impossible task of grading every single player in every single game, on every single play. So you hear that and you're like, that must be a headache, and it very much is. I'm luckily not one of the graders, honestly. But yeah, so we try to do that, and you might look at it and be like, oh, you look at me, some skinny kid, and it's like, oh, this guy's evaluating offensive linemen. It's like, no, I'm not. And the guys who are grading them have actually been trained by former NFL offensive linemen. The Bruce Gradkowski, longtime NFL backup quarterback, he was actually the guy. Now he's coaching now, of course. But he was actually the guy that was grading all the throws for quarterbacks. So we have guys that know what they're looking at. It's not just me out there looking at it and be like, oh, this is what Kingsley is supposed to be doing on this play. I'm sure Kingsley would tell me, dude, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And he's probably right. So yeah, you look at some of our graders, and they try to do that. They are very well trained in that aspect. So I will also say this, as good as the graders are, the grades aren't perfect. And I know it's the big stat that you look at for PFF. We actually do a ton more stats than just grades. And I think the other stats are pretty much just as valuable as grades. So when you look at some of my lists and I put out the top 10 returning quarterbacks, it's not just, hey, these are the top 10 returning quarterbacks ordered by PFF grade. PFF grade plays a part in it, but a lot of other stuff plays a part in it too. And we keep track of literally everything. Like I have Ultimate open right now. If you want to see the highest graded guys or the guys who have the most passing yards on Monday Night Football in 70+ degree weather, I could show you that right now. It's pretty insane, this database that we have. So yeah, it's a massive database, and we keep track of literally everything. And luckily, I'm not one of the data collectors. They are doing God's work right now. But yeah, we kind of try to do everything for college football and the NFL. And XFL and USFL stuff too.
Sure, and that's the thing about it is I love it because I'm a football junkie. So getting a kind of a deep dive on stuff like this helps me understand the game at I guess a better level in my mind. And I think most people that seem to do that seem to understand football. And you mentioned the fact you guys have different grades that are out there because I've trust me, I've explored PFF's depth and breadth of all these stats, and there's a never-ending treasure trove, it feels like, of different things to pull from. But nonetheless, as we turn our attention for BYU entering the Big 12 conference this fall, you mentioned top 10 quarterbacks. Obviously, they have Kedon Slovis taking over as their starting quarterback. Two-time transfer, started at USC, had injuries, then jumps to Pitt for one season, and now finally, as in his final year of eligibility, comes to BYU. What are the hopes in your mind of him having more of what he kind of showed early on in his USC career for BYU versus maybe more of what he showed in the latter part of that tenure in Los Angeles as well as at Pitt?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that was someone that I talked to Kingsley about in our interview, and he even mentioned him. And I was like, hey, man, what do you think about Kedon so far? And he was like, listen, we were terrified because we really were hoping that Jaron would come back to school. He decided to obviously leave for the NFL draft. And they're like, we had no idea we were going to do a quarterback. Thankfully Kedon comes in, and he's like, man, that dude can sling the ball. He's like, I am so excited to be protecting that guy's blind side. When I mentioned the name Kedon Slovis, his eyes lit up. So I think BYU fans should be pretty excited. And yeah, Kedon Slovis was a guy that my colleague Anthony Tresh was super high on a few years ago. And he's been like, this is a guy who's going to be a future number one overall pick. Don't think he's going to be like that anymore. But what made him such a great player at USC, and of course he's bounced around now a couple times, but yeah, he was just an accurate passer. I think that's what BYU is getting. And good processor too, not great mobility. He doesn't have the strongest arm in the world, but he's just a supremely accurate quarterback. And that's why he succeeded really at USC. So yeah, I think BYU fans should be very, very excited. And Kingsley for sure is very, very excited about protecting his blind side next year.
What obviously you mentioned that the Big 12 obviously is going to be a step up in competition for BYU overall. Can you help Cougar fans kind of quantify what maybe the biggest challenges in your mind for BYU will be as they make this leap now from, I guess, a pseudo Power 5 program to truly being a Power 5 college football team?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the big thing is the schedule. You're going to be playing pretty much, a Power 5 team every week. And I know BYU, in terms of Group of 5 teams, BYU was one of the best Group of 5 teams in terms of playing a Power 5 schedule. They played the Oregons, they played the Stanfords and other teams like that. But it's a little bit different now playing the Power 5. And I think the big thing in the Big 12, obviously, the big thing in the Big 12 is the offense is just really, really good in the Big 12, especially this year. Texas offense looks absolutely ridiculous. If Quinn Ewers can take that next step, that offense should be absolutely absurd. I think they, skill position-wise, I put them right behind Ohio State for the best in the country. Oklahoma got Dylan Gabriel coming back at quarterback too. So those two teams, luckily for BYU fans, they won't have to worry about those two teams for more than just next year because then obviously they're both bolting for the SEC. But yeah, the big thing is really that the offense in the Big 12 is so good. So yeah, I mean, BYU is not the only one joining the Big 12. They got 3 other Group of 5 teams joining too. So it's kind of a new look Big 12 next year. I'm really excited about. But yeah, I'd say the big thing for them is just like the offensive jump. The quality is going to be, could be a lot for the defense at first, but I'm pretty confident that BYU will be able to handle it.
Did Kingsley, I guess in your conversation with him, did he mention anything about his relationship with Aaron Roderick, the offensive coordinator? This is a guy, most BYU fans can rattle it off. He's put Zach Wilson in the NFL, Jaron Hall in the NFL, and the hope is he can put Keaton Slovis next year into the NFL alongside a guy like Kingsley. What is your perception, I guess, of Aaron Roderick, or maybe something that Kingsley passed along to you about their offensive coordinator?
Yeah, he mentioned Aaron a couple times. We talked about the head coach, Kalani, who I think is a superstar. And he mentioned, he's like, yeah, man, I just love all my coaches. He's like, I'm really close with all my coaches. He mentioned Aaron. And he was like, yeah, I just love that they can make me, allow me to be who I am. I could go out there, I could joke around in the meetings. And then obviously, you look at the interview and he was saying, once I step onto the field, it's over. The jokes are over. I'm there to kill you, basically. So yeah, he mentioned Aaron and he mentioned how, he's just really close to all his coaches. So I think BYU is a great culture right now, man. I really do believe that. And I think Aaron is a big part of it. Obviously, Kalani Sitake is a big part of it too. And Kingsley was just mentioned all the coaches. It was like, yeah, I just love that they let me and let my teammates just be who we are and have fun with it. And then obviously when it's go time, it's go time. But yeah, I think that's why they've been able to be so successful over the last few years, just because they're letting players be themselves.
And the other thing about this is you mentioned the fact that Big 12, its reputation is very much offensive focus. And BYU, their defense, looking at PFF's grades alone last year, was not great. What do you think is realistic for, I guess, a Big 12 program in terms of just overall showing on defense? Because you're going up against elite offense seemingly every single week when it goes into Big 12 play. What, I guess, is the hope for a BYU fan that's hoping for improved defensive play this year when they may be facing better offenses than they ever have overall?
Yeah, so they should be having a good secondary, I think, is the big thing you need in the Big 12 because of how elite those passing attacks are. But, they have some bright spots, BYU does, on that defense. Tyler Batty graded out really, really well for us this past year. The edge defender had like an 81.6 grade, really good run defender for us, and a pretty good pass rusher too. So he's a guy that I think is probably the leader of that defense heading into next year. But yeah, it's just you're dealing with a lot of spread offenses. You're dealing with a lot of explosive passing attacks and some good run games too. So yeah, that's kind of the thing I would be looking out for. So, I mean, you would know better than me how good BYU secondary is going into next year, but it's got to be pretty good, honestly, if you want to, unless, Keaton Slovis is out there, has to sling 4 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns a game, because it could get, there are high scoring games in the Big 12 and those games last forever because of it. So, yeah, they're going to need to be able to defend the pass a little bit better.
Well, BYU fans of a certain age, that I know there's a number of them that watch this, will be able to rattle off. They called it the Wacky Whack back in the 1990s for BYU, and there were games in that history, Max, and I can remember them. I'm old enough to remember some of these. Ty Detmer playing a 52-52 tie against San Diego State in 91. Like there are some legendary, and so I guess BYU fans are not averse to having, I guess, the option of having those high-flying shootouts, but at the same time, they probably like to see a little more defense as they make the Power 5 transition. All right, I got a couple more questions for you about BYU, and a great comment I saw from Pro Football Focus from Kingsley about BYU kind of assuming, I would call it an underdog mentality as they go into the Big 12. We'll finish off our conversation with Max Chadwick here in just a minute on that front. Before we do that, though, need to get another word in on one of our great sponsors, local sponsor here on the podcast, our friends over at Perry Homes. Whether you're looking for your first home or ready to upgrade to your dream home, Perry Homes has a house for you. For 50 years, Perry Homes has been Utah's premier home builder with communities throughout throughout the states. They got many communities, home designs, and price points to help meet your needs. Best part is no matter where you want to live here in Utah, they got options for you. Davis, Salt Lake, Tooele, and Utah counties. Also multiple communities in Washington County near St. George in the southern end of the state if you want to move down that way. They have over 50 unique home designs from ramblers to 2 stories to townhomes as well. They even have quick move-in homes available if you're ready to make the move right away. So visit perryhomesutah.com to see what's new in Utah's finest neighborhoods. That's perryhomesutah.com. For 50 years, Utah has been coming home to Perry Homes. Continuing on now with Max Chadwick of Pro Football Focus. And Max, I've been meaning to ask you about this in particular. Preferred walk-on. I love the name of it, but explain what preferred walk-on is.
Yeah, for sure. So all these interviews, the great Dave Safaro, who I know you interacted with in setting this whole thing up, he's our PR guy, and he has been just unbelievable in terms of getting interviews for me. And, I turn these interviews into feature articles, which is great. But I'm like, man, I want to put these interviews out in full and edit them up and make them look cool. So I started the show, Preferred Walk On, where all the interviews, eventually Kingsley, I'll be posting that one soon. I have to edit it up after a number of ones. But, Dave has gotten me guys like Caleb Williams, like Joe Alts, we mentioned before, like Olu Fashanu, Jordan Travis, Jaden Daniels, just like a ton of superstars, honestly. And it's been a dream come true, honestly. And I'm like, man, I just don't want to let these just be articles, and that's it. I want to, make these as much as possible. So it's a podcast, it's a YouTube channel. You can check it out, Preferred Walk On. So yeah, and I'm doing more than just the interviews too. I'm turning some of my articles into videos, like my top 10. I'm going top 10 every single position, ranking the top 10 players. And so yeah, that's basically what it is right now. But yeah, a big reason why I wanted to start it was to let these interviews live on in YouTube and audio form as well too.
Well, you know it as well as I do. It's all about multimedia universe out there these days. You got to be written, digital, right, audio. It's all got to be covered. So I love it. I'm going to be obviously following you. I'll be listening to those interviews because I think it's fun to get those exclusives, those one-on-one conversations. You get stuff that you won't find anywhere else. But I saw it on Pro Football Focus, their college Twitter handle, and they tagged it saying, message to the Big 12, don't sleep on BYU. And the quote is from Kingsley Suamataia, and I'm assuming this is from your conversation, is BYU is the underdog coming in, but it's cool. They'll see what we have when we start playing. And I think that goes back to a comment you made earlier that Kingsley, this dude, he seems like when he crosses that painted line, it's all business on the football field.
Yeah, 1,000%. Yeah, that quote did come from my conversation with him. And yeah, he really was like that. Where I mentioned, the two sides of Kingsley where he makes me belly laugh with like the whoever has the bigger nuts and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden then he turns it on and you're like, oh wow, this guy, I'm thankful that's a Zoom interview right now because otherwise this guy might kill me. So yeah, he really can flip the switch pretty quickly. But yeah, he mentioned that quote where he's like, yeah man, I look at the Big 12 right now, obviously we're the new bloods coming in alongside Houston, Cincinnati, and UCF heading into the Big 12 next year. And yeah, everyone's probably looking at them and saying, okay, they're going to take some time to adjust to a Power 5 level. And he's like, no, we're not. We're ready for this. And, that was the big thing he was saying. He's like, yeah, they think of us as an underdog right now, but we're going to come in and we're going to try to shock the world. So, yeah, that was another one of those quotes. I was like, all right, man, let's go. So, yeah, he seems to be pretty confident. I'm pretty confident, too, that BYU, it won't be an adjustment too much for BYU. I think they'll be able to go in there and compete, especially in the trenches. That's where I think BYU will really succeed next year. In the trenches, especially when they see a guy like Kingsley lining up across them and be like, oh, okay, like they're for real a little bit. So, yeah, I think in the trenches, they're going to be able to compete a little bit in the Big 12.
Now, obviously, success is all relative. It's all dependent on each fan, what they consider to be success. But I've kind of stated on this podcast that I think the baseline for BYU year one here in the Big 12 should be to get to 6-6, get to a bowl game. Anything beyond that, I think would be a fairly successful debut as a Power 5 program. You have any thoughts on where you think BYU might land at the end of this campaign?
Yeah, I would say a bowl game would constitute a successful season. We mentioned before they lose a lot of really, really big players from that team last year. Jaron Hall, I mentioned before, Blake Freeland, Puka Nacua, I'm a big fan of at receiver. He's gone now too. So yeah, I think unfortunately for Cougars fans, I don't know if this team will make a bowl game. I think maybe a 5-7, 6-6 sounds around right too. So yeah, I think if they make a bowl game, I would definitely constitute that as a successful season. And if Kedon Slovis is everything that Kingsley is making him out to be, I mean, they could very easily be a bowl eligible team next year.
Well, and that's the thing about that. BYU fans, they know when you have high-level quarterback play in pro, but you can go back through the 50-plus years since Lavelle Edwards became the head coach. When he's had a high-level quarterback, you can think of Gifford Nielsen, Jim McMahon, Steve Young. Traditionally, when you got that type of quarterback for BYU, wins follow, but they never played at the Power 5 level like they will this season. I think that's going to be kind of the interesting dynamic to see, okay, is Keaton Slovis capable of being that level of a quarterback, but at the same time, the increased competition level that BYU is going up against, it makes for a whole nother element of this, and I think it's going to be very exciting to see where BYU ultimately lands at the end of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just mentioned before, they have the great quarterback, Zach Wilson, too, in that regard. Not really in the NFL right now. But yeah, they have Keaton Slovis, who I think is a good quarterback, solid quarterback. Don't know if he's a great one. I don't know if he'll be as good as even Jaron Hall was, honestly, because it has been some time since we've seen the really good Keaton Slovis at USC. He could turn it around. But yeah, I think that, 6-6 is reasonable. For me, I would be a little bit lower. I don't quite think they'll make it to the bowl game. I'll probably say 5-7 for the Cougars. But yeah, a bowl game, like I said, would be a very successful year, especially your first year in a Power 5 conference.
All right, Max, I guess last thing from me, is there anything else from your conversation with Kingsley or anything else about BYU you'd like to pass along to Cougar fans?
Yeah, I mean, Kingsley, I don't know what else to say about Kingsley other than I love the guy. He just was genuinely one of my favorite interviews that I've had so far. And he's being trained. He mentioned in the interview how he's being trained by his older cousin, Penei Sewell, who was a superstar in college, now a superstar in the NFL for the Lions. So, yeah, they should be pretty excited about what Kingsley has, especially now that he's playing his natural position of left tackle. I'm pretty excited to see what Kingsley has in store next year.
Well, Max, last thing is, where can BYU fans find all your work in all of its various forms?
Yeah, of course. So you can find it at pff.com. All the articles live on there. And then, like I mentioned before, Preferred Walk-On is available wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever. And also mainly as a YouTube channel where all the interviews eventually will be. I posted like 6 of them so far. I've edited them together with a lot of their highlights and everything like that. And all different videos surrounding college football live on that channel as well. So you can find it at Preferred Walk-On. And you also find me on Twitter and TikTok and wherever at Chad_Maxwick.
Well, the best part is I think most BYU fans either watching this and or listening to it are familiar with finding podcasts like that, so I think they'll be able to track it down. But, Max, thanks again for carving out some time for us, and look forward to maybe catching up with you as the season gets a little bit closer, all right?
I really appreciate it, Jake. Thank you.
All right, there you go. Max Chadwick from Pro Football Focus. Obviously, make sure you check out Preferred Walk-On. Big thank you to him for taking the time. Just a reminder for you guys, have a great weekend. We'll be back on Monday recapping everything that happens in BYU sports over the weekend as well. And make sure to also check out our YouTube channel, as mentioned, both Preferred Walk-On and Locked On Cougars. And a big thank you once again for making us your first listen of the day and being everydayers with us here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Until next time, this has been the Locked On Cougars Podcast. See ya.